I didn't ask Dan. I already knew what his answer would be. All I know is that I was shaking as my hand hovered over the computer keyboard. I reread the ad I wrote for an online erotic site. Attractive lady available for romantic interludes with discerning gentlemen. It read. I pressed the send button. I put my face in my hands and burst into tears. My name is Dana. I think anyone would say that I'm quite attractive. Of course, I'm not an enthusiastic beauty, but I can always control myself at parties. I have a slender build, weight almost 57 kilos with a height of 165 centimeters. The chest is small, but elastic. The stomach is as flat as it was at 18 years old. This is the result of my training in the gym 3 times a week for the last decade. I remember the day my husband Dan bought a Corvette. He was so proud of it, polishing it and wiping it down. He always had a soft cotton cloth in his hands, and whenever he was near it, he constantly wiped it. I went with him several times, but he did not allow me to drive. Too much power, it's easy to get confused, he told me, masterfully driving the car. This was true, but Dan drove very well, so I wasn't worried. I remember a knock on the door. I was just putting fresh pastries in the oven to bake. Dan should be back soon. He loved my home-baked goods. I switched him to low-calorie sugar, realizing that Dan had a small spare tire in the middle area. I hoped he wouldn't notice the difference. I was still holding the mittens on my hands when I opened the door. There were 2 police officers standing there, and my world collapsed around me. Almost a full year passed before I was allowed to bring Dan home. His crushed body was strapped to a wheelchair with only the use of his left arm. He operated the remote control quite deftly, his hand strapped to the armrest so that his fingers could keep the buttons within easy reach. He could not speak or turn his head. I took care of his bodily functions and constantly monitored his body temperature. But inside, it was my Dan, the man I loved. He used his still-functioning fingers to try to write, painstakingly putting words together on the screen he sat in front of. The idea was to sell some of his work to help our rapidly dwindling finances. Things weren't going very well. Reading some of Dan's work, I felt that he was several different people. Sometimes he wrote as a woman, sometimes as a man. Several different men, several different women. Words came out of him in pieces. Parts of reality and fantasy were strangely mixed. I realized that the world he lived in now was almost entirely inside him. Then I began the process of putting this whole crazy quilt of his pieces together in a specific order that would make sense. There was a book, a story, if I could sell it. As the days passed, our lives slowly went downhill. There was insurance. I remember Dan talking about it the day we signed the policy. No matter what happens, we will be okay, he told me, hugging me. I have always found it difficult to pay insurance premiums. Several times I thought it was a waste of money that we needed so much. But now, that wasn't enough. I realized that nothing is ever enough. Most of the medical expenses were covered. But what about life and living expenses? 90% of all medical expenses. 1 point read. It sounded great, except for the first $10,000 we paid, a deductible to keep the policy affordable. In addition, his accounts exceeded $1 million, and they grew. In just 2 short years, I was behind on my house payments. Our tiny savings account that we added $100 every month to see us through until retirement, long over. I even sold our new minivan and bought an old Dodge. State disability is a benefit, it helps, but nothing more. I couldn't work full-time, and Dan needed constant care to maintain his body temperature and take care of his other needs. It was possible to leave for a few hours, but nothing more. Of course, I tried to hire someone to help, but my secretarial skills limited my potential income. A caregiver cost more than I could earn. Plus, try to get hired somewhere with a disabled husband, hoping for company insurance. Well, yes, of course it will work. Now the bank wanted to take our house. The nice man who came to talk to me was very sorry, but then he looked me up and down with a grin and said that we can think of something. I understood what he meant. Eventually, it came to this. We were $2,000 behind schedule every month. I returned to caring for Dan. There was nothing to do but wait. I wasn't sure that anyone would be interested in a 32-year-old housewife. But we didn't have to wait long. When I opened my email, I saw a dozen replies. Several of them were downright rude. Only one seemed normal to me. He introduced himself as Carl. I responded by sending a photo of myself taken on the beach in a conservative swimsuit. I received a response almost instantly, and after several surprisingly polite emails, we set a date to meet in the lobby of a local hotel. I was scared to death as I got dressed in my best black evening dress with a drop-off shoulder on one side and a slit down the sides to mid-thigh. I carefully cut my hair, powdered my hair, and did my makeup and hair. After thinking about sexy lingerie, I realized it wasn't necessary. After spending some money we couldn't afford, I ordered a taxi. I didn't want Carl to know what I was driving, partly because the car was cheap, and partly so I couldn't be traced to my home. My sexual experience thus far had been limited to a few encounters in the back seat of a car in high school and a few short-term flings in college. Then I met Dan, a wonderful and gentle lover. We fell in love. We were so happy. But Dan wasn't into wild sex. We were, well, normal. Therefore, I had absolutely no idea what to do or what to expect from the man I was about to meet. "Looking good, lady," said the taxi driver, dropping me off at the hotel. I didn't answer. Plucking up my courage, I entered the hall. Letting my eyes adjust, I looked around for Carl. Not seeing him, she headed to the bar and ordered a soda. Several minutes passed before I saw him. He also looked around. Noticing me, he approached. "Of the day?" I turned around, giving him my best forced smile. He was about 50 years old, tall and well-dressed. Gray hair was visible at his temples, but the smile on his face calmed me a little. "You are much more beautiful than in the photograph." "Thank you," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. "Maybe we can retire to my room." It was fitting. I finished my soda and stood up. His room was located very high up. I looked around when he opened the door. It wasn't cheap. For some reason, this helped. "Music?" "Certainly." I found a sofa and settled down on it as the soft sounds of a female singer filled the air. He joined me on the couch and handed me an envelope. I almost made the mistake of asking what it was for, but then I realized that it would contain the $500 I asked for. I didn't open it to count it. Then I realized that he was looking at me expectantly. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Small talk? Perhaps seduction? "What would you like?" I asked. He looked at me strangely. "Could you take off your clothes for me?" I hesitated. He looked at me strangely again. "Have you ever done this before?" "No." I burst into tears. I couldn't help myself. He hugged me and waited for me to stop. He looked awkward. "Look, we can just—" "No, I have to." She quickly stood up and pulled the strap off her shoulder. I unzipped and pulled down the dress. I was naked underneath. Carl smiled and looked down at me intently. I fought the urge to cross my arms over my chest and cover my groin with my palms. She just stood there and waited, letting him watch. He took his time and seemed to like what he saw. "I assume you will give caresses to my manhood below the belt?" "Yes." I knelt in front of him, struggling again. I had only had minor attempts with Dan and was completely at a loss as to what to do. Reaching towards the front of Carl's trousers, I managed to loosen the waistband and undo the top button. Then, lightning. I reached to each side and pulled, my movements not graceful. He lifted his hips to help me, a funny look on his face. Expecting great excitement, I was surprised to find virtually no signs. Reaching out my hand, I began to excite his male instrument. Easier. Tease him. I mumbled something and continued, trying to keep my teeth at a distance. I read about this somewhere. Finally, he got horny and grew a lot. Looking up, I saw his eyelids flutter. I realized that he could reach climax. Carl reached down and stopped me before this happened. He pulled me towards the sofa and then pressed me from behind. He started feeling me, touching my breasts and kissing them. It seemed to me that my body was beginning to betray me. I felt how excitement was flooding me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Carl's hand dropped to my groin area. Then I just relaxed and let him. I knew he could sense my arousal, and the thought made me blush. Then he took me. At first, my body seemed to shrink, But then I took a deep breath. I did it. I let it happen. I felt him pause to regain control. He was stretching out time, I knew. I was struggling to hold back my climax and was losing the battle. I fought to keep my mind focused on Dan, what this was for him, for us, not for me. Then all I could do was feel the sensations. My body, untouched for over a year, was burning. I know, I screamed as the first wave rolled over me, quickly followed by the second. I no longer allowed myself to be taken. I gave back. Then I felt Carl shudder. I realized that he had reached climax. Then I remembered the condoms I bought. They were still in my purse. Stupid of me. Carl exhaled and leaned back on the couch. I jumped up and went to the bathroom, washing off everything I could. God, that's the kind of professional I am, I thought. Returning naked to the living room, I reached for my dress. Carl sat there, also naked, and studied me while I changed my clothes. There was a satisfied expression on his face. "It was unusual," he said. "Thank you," I muttered. "You will master this. I guess this shows that I don't—" My voice trailed off. "Yes, it was fun. Do you have a business card?" I didn't have one. Finding a piece of paper, I wrote down my number. "I have several friends who would be interested in you," he told me. I simply nodded. "Not many of you girls are real." He grinned. "Good night," I told him, actually blushing as I headed for the door. On the way to the elevator, I counted the money in the envelope. Yes, $500. I put them in my purse. I caught a taxi on the street. The driver looked me up and down as I sat down. Having named the address, we drove out onto the road. Halfway there, I caught his eye in the mirror. "Are you working?" "God, is this already visible?" "Yes. There's no point in denying now." "How many?" I smiled at him. $500. $500? He exclaimed. "Not a damn thing. Too rich for me, lady. Maybe we can swap for trips?" I didn't answer. As we drove through the dark streets towards the house, I leaned my head against the window. A tear ran down my cheek. Yes, I'm a working girl. Even the driver could already notice it. Never in my previous life would I have even thought about allowing men to have sex with me for money. But sometimes life brings twists and turns. I allow men and some women to use the most intimate parts of me for their own satisfaction. Some try to be kind and loving, wanting me to reassure them of this. I quickly transform into a loving woman who idolizes them. I make them feel powerful, wanted. Some women look down on me. I hold my head high. Is their mink coat, diamond ring, or luxurious dinner any different from my envelope with money? I have a need to see it this way. It helps me think sensibly. Some men hire me to grab me and call me names, clinging to me not in passion, but in fear, even hatred. I become obedient. I do what they tell me. I was called a slut, a bitch, and other obscene names. These words are meant to put me down, to make someone else feel better than me, in their own world. I just let them use me, be in charge. But are they really better? They all do the same thing as me. The difference is that they have to pay me to do it at all. In truth, I think I may be a better person than the men and women who use me. Most would use me if I let them, but most can't, unless they pay. Otherwise, they wouldn't be good enough. I have to believe in it to continue. $500 for a quick hour of intimacy, if that's the correct term, seemed high to me. I was surprised that they were so willing to pay for it. Carl took me under his wing, so to speak. He became a kind of protector. Some would call him a pimp, but he wasn't. He didn't take anything from me that I didn't allow. He always paid. He also had business partners and mentioned me to some of them. Over time, I served several of his business partners. Soon they turned into a continuous blur of faces. I soon became numb to all the scenarios, all the illegal desires that I was hired to fulfill. I became very good at reading what the client wanted, a few simple changes in demeanor and body language, and their reaction would tell me what to do. I received $500 each time, plus Carl also paid me for taking care of his clients. Carl also invited me to his place every couple of weeks. I felt comfortably with him. He was the only one I allowed without a condom. The first time I simply forgot him. After that, the need disappeared. With him, I unmistakably reached climax. Somehow, even though I was being paid, Carl became my outlet for my body's needs. Otherwise, my life became about meeting Dan's needs and scheduling the next appointment. Financial improvements in Dan's life and my life came quickly. I got a loan from the bank and used some of the extra money to buy equipment that automatically monitored and regulated Dan's body temperature. I installed an alarm system in case something happens while I'm not home. One touch, and the home nurse can respond in minutes. These devices changed my life. Now I could go away for several hours instead of 2 or 3. I even bought a better car, a used one, but at least it wasn't beat up or noisy. My life became a routine. Get up, feed Dan, take care of his needs, then shower, and get ready for whoever was on my schedule. It seemed like almost every day there was someone on my schedule. Dan didn't seem to notice, or at least he never mentioned it to me. Although we often talked, he typed words, and I spoke to him. It took me 3 long years to pay off my medical bills, and during that same period, I paid off our house. All that remained were the current costs of treatment and accommodation. I remember the day the insurance ran out. Another sweet item in small print that came as an add-on and said, "For a maximum of 5 years." Now I have accepted my fate. The tears over what I did for a living have long gone. It would be more correct to say that I have become numb. Only with Carl did I allow myself to relax. With the others, I screamed and dodged. I learned to pretend well. One day, when I arrived home from a meeting with a client, there was a white van parked outside my house. It was Connie, our home health nurse. We had an alarm installed that Dan could press if he needed help. I rushed inside, worried that something had happened. Connie was examining Dan's right leg, and she looked at me, looking me up and down, disapprovingly. I realized that she saw my too short skirt, too much neckline and too much makeup, and understood everything. I was probably blushing. "What's happened?" "His finger and foot are infected." "But how?" "He can't feel it. It looks like maybe he wrote on the screen that he was in pain." Dan was taken to the hospital, treated, and tested. Somehow, the feeling was returning to his legs. One of his toenails, which I had carelessly trimmed, became ingrown and infected. It was just lucky that he regained sensitivity and noticed it. My life and what I did was for him, but became my life and what I did for myself. I missed all the signs. Dan finally pressed the button to get outside help to handle what should have been my job. I didn't notice this, immersed in my world of sex and money. And then I realized that he knew too. I sat and cried for hours. After Dan returned home, I didn't go anywhere for several weeks. I spent all my time caring for and working with him. Then something else happened. One day I washed him and changed his bottle. He got a little excited, and I took care of it. Raising my head, I saw tears in his eyes. A few days later, I spoke with Carl, explaining that I was going to try to find a job. Carl invited me to work for him. My secretarial skills were a perfect fit for his business. "Besides, I don't want to lose you," he added. I knew what that meant, and I knew that my job would probably also involve caring for Carl and meeting his needs. Possibly my own, of course. The difference was obvious to me. I would have sex with one man I liked for money, or I could have sex with a whole bunch of men I didn't care about for money. At least that's what I thought at the time. I agreed to this job. I did well, and in more than 2 months Carl never asked it or suggested having sex. On some days, young women came and entered his office. I was just doing my job, not really missing sex. In addition, Carl paid me very well, and I became almost satisfied. My own desires took a back seat as my mind was occupied with all the new aspects of working full-time. One day I was typing up a series of sales reports on one of Carl's product lines when he called me. I grabbed my notepad, getting ready to write down the letter. "You won't need this," he said as I entered his office. "What?" And then I understood. Probably, somewhere in my fantasy world, I, again, became Dana, a conservative housewife. I put the notepad down and took a deep breath. Then I let a smile cover my face, preparing for what I thought would happen next. "Please sit down. I need to ask you something." Confused, I sat down. "Tonight, 3 clients are coming to my city. They will stay here for several days." I tried my best not to react. "They are Japanese and they asked for personal entertainment?" The last question was, I knew what he wanted. "They asked you?" "Certainly." I managed to hide my sign. Carl nodded. "Thank you. I'll make it worth your effort." I smiled and returned to my desk. Japanese gentlemen would probably tip well, I thought. I sat and thought about it. Nothing special. Nothing I haven't done before. But I knew I didn't want this. I wanted to be at home with my man, living like the sweet conservative housewife I used to be. But I've already calculated that we're behind on the bills again. It's time to go to work. Yes, you can't know what this life is like until you live it like I did. I lowered my head into my hands, but there were no tears. They left me long ago. I'm Dana, a working girl. I myself took a step towards this, knowing that there was no turning back. Not really. You can hide, you can pretend. You can move, take your husband and try again in another city. The next man I meet will probably remember me. There were thousands of them, and I had nowhere to go. The end result will be the same. No matter what, I will always be who I am. I serve men for money. If you hire me, you are no better than me. In fact, you are just like me. I'm just letting you feel that it's different. So if you do that, you're just John. And I'm just a